Good evening, everyone. So, this is the crew, okay, that could resist the fact that there's rain outside and there is moisture in the air, and it's okay for you to come out and not melt. Well, I'm glad to see all of you. There perhaps will be others that will join us as we go along. Does everyone have a Constitution of the United States? Okay, great. If you don't, okay, we have a couple that can give you that to go with us as we go through the evening. My name is Roger DeRosier. I'm a former U.S. history and government teacher in Millbury, at Millbury High. I taught for 32 years. I retired about 10 years ago. I started a nonprofit a year and a half ago called the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education. I taught a program started in 1987 called the We the People, eventually became also known as the Citizen and the Constitution. This program helped me as a teacher to be able to give students some foundational understanding about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and basically the evolution of our government through the present. What was impactful to me was the students basically remembered considerably more than they had when I was not using the program. So I don't think it was me, I think it was the program that helped me to be able to allow for students to have a better understanding of the Constitution, as I said, the Bill of Rights, and others. So the bottom line is, today, there are several people that are here. Many of them are teachers. Some are people who are civic educators. Others are people who are part of the board of directors for the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education. They're all civic education people who believe that we have a big task ahead of us. The task that we have is to learn about the government that we live under and to understand it through the eyes and the prism of our founders, of our framers, so that we don't get confused with the way in which our government has essentially evolved through media accounts, through political leaders, okay, points of view, and things of that nature. So those are some of the things that we feel pretty strongly about. And so as you'll see in some of the next slides, our intent is to take what we're doing here tonight and to go and do this elsewhere throughout the Commonwealth as we try and enter into conversations with people about what our government is all about. So this is something that 4 years ago, some of you that are in this room were here at that time. 4 years ago, I did a presentation on the Constitution. So as a result, given that we were in Millbury, I decided that it would be an appropriate thing to start and inaugurate our new program, which we call CitizenLyceum. It would be a good idea to do that here in Millbury, and for 3 reasons. The first is the Lyceum movement began right here in Millbury. The American Lyceum movement. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides, as you can see. This is our Mass Center for Civic Ed. What's our intent? Well, our intent is simply to promote as much as we can civic education. We do it primarily through our schools, but you'll notice that we're doing it, okay, primary through high school, through college, and we're looking at it from the point of view of continuing ed. And continuing ed would be what? Adult learning. So our goal is to try and make and give enough people the background and the foundation that they can then use to make the judgments that they need to make as we continue progressing in our system. The Lyceum movement, as many of you know, started with Aristotle. the Greek philosopher in the 4th century BC, when he began this process where people would just simply gather, come together, have discussions, talk about different topics, and basically learn from each other. In 1826, a man by the name of Josiah Holbrook, who was a resident of Millbury at the time, a graduate of Yale University, started the American Lyceum movement, which he borrowed, by the way, from the Scots. Okay, and he brought it over here and then started it, and it started to get some gravitas. It started to do pretty well. So by the 1830s, we have a fundamentally strong adult learning program that's going on in the Northeast and the Midwest. And it continues right through the Civil War. After the Civil War, what we see is that the movement starts to die out, but not the interest in learning. What happens is we start having what is called the Chautauqua movement. And the Chautauqua movement was also adult learning, but a little bit different in focus. So the key is for us is today is, or this year, is the 190th anniversary of the beginning of the American Lyceum movement right here in Millbury. And it's also, for those of you who are familiar with the community, won't surprise you, this was also the year that this building was started. Its construction was begun in 1826. So kind of great confluence of information. Notice that the topics that they dealt with were pretty scientific: geology, astronomy, important for farmers to get more and more information. However, even by the 1830s, you had people like Henry Clay, you had people like Daniel Webster, even Abraham Lincoln gave one of his talks in 1838 in Illinois that was at a lyceum. And so the Lyceum movement, okay, grew from that. Now, the Citizen Lyceum is our idea of trying to do this adult learning, but doing it for the very purpose of making sure that everybody can learn more as adults about what's going on in our country. Please note, our purpose here is to be nonpartisan, non-political, non-ideological. Our intent, okay, is merely to give information, not to sway anyone. So we're going to be talking tonight, and we'll be doing this pretty much with all of our talks going forward. We're going to devote a good deal of time to understanding the three basic principles that our founders were most intent on making sure that the government was based upon: constitutionalism, liberalism, and republicanism. And just before we get ahead of ourselves, I just want to make sure that everybody understands liberalism has nothing to do with being a liberal, and Republican has nothing to do with being a Republican in the Republican Party. But we'll see that as we go on. Through this lens, I want everyone to recognize the subtle differences that arose among the framers, among the founders, so that even though people are going to be very pro-Constitution, we call them Federalists, and those are going to be very against this Constitution, we call them Anti-Federalists, they both groups highly believed in the importance and the value of constitutionalism, liberalism, and republicanism. They didn't disagree on that. They disagreed on the degree of what may be constitutional, liberal, and Republican. So we're going to go from there, and let's see. Today's topic, of course, as you know, is the Bill of Rights. I got this picture of the Bill of Rights as it looks today at the National Archives. How unfortunate. Notice okay, how it's really faded quite a bit. Now, I know that many of you are aware that the National Archives is doing as much as they possibly can to keep our founding documents in the best shape as possible. So it's not an easy read, as you can see. But fortunately, others have translated for us, and it is in your constitutional books that we passed out to everyone, so that you have a chance to see what the Constitution is all about. Today's agenda will be in 5 parts. We're going to talk fundamentally, as I've already mentioned, talking about the main principles. We're then going to talk about the background. How did the Bill of Rights, okay, become a dominant force in this new government? How was the Bill of Rights produced? What has been the evolution of the Bill of Rights? And today's view on the Bill of Rights. We may end up, okay, at that time, depending upon where we're at, we may end up just throwing out ideas, although it would be great to have a discussion. So the first idea is constitutional. What is constitutionalism? Simply put, it is the limitation on government. Secondly, it is rule of law. I've given you 2 quotes, okay, by John Patrick in his book, Understanding Government. The first simply says that government can't arbitrarily make up laws and enforce laws the way they want. That's not, okay, what they are supposed to be able to do. Secondly, the rule of law means that neither government officials nor the common citizens are allowed to violate the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, or the laws enacted in accordance with it. So you've all heard the term rule of law. We've heard it, okay, bandied about frequently. It simply means that we cannot and do not expect our leaders, as well as we citizens, to basically violate, okay, the laws and get away with it. So that's the premise. So limitations on government. If anything that you leave here with tonight, one of the things ought to be our framers and founders created a government primarily where the government itself was to be limited. That's the foundation of creating this government. Why? Well, I'm not going to go into that today, but the history with England certainly, okay, was an example to the Americans at that time. This is a problem. Okay, we look at the fact that governments arbitrarily do things. If you remember some of your world history and some of your medieval history, you may remember how kings often, okay, arbitrarily imprisoned people simply because they spoke out, okay, against the monarchy. So there were all kinds of these examples. These were well known to our American founders, and they didn't want a repeat of that. Secondly, we have this notion called liberalism. Oh, sorry, forgive me. I wanted to make the connection between constitutionalism and, okay, the Bill of Rights. So if you look, the First Amendment, first 5 words, I think for many of you, it will come as a surprise. It says, Congress shall make no law. Now, the reason I say it should be a surprise is most of us, when we hear the Bill of Rights, what are we thinking of? We're thinking about the rights that we have guaranteed. We're thinking about our liberties that we have protected by the government. But the irony is, if the first 5 words of the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, are saying Congress shall make no law, what's the intention here? The intention is to limit government. Look at the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Who would do the infringement? It would be government. So as a result, okay, one can make the argument, okay, that the Second Amendment essentially says Congress has no right to do this. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and belongings against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Again, using their history with the British oftentimes would use general warrants, enter into the warehouses and the ships, and essentially, okay, take whatever they wanted and incarcerate, okay, the ship owner or the merchant and those, okay, involved. They didn't want a repeat of that. They didn't want general search warrants. It's very articulate. I didn't go into the details of it, but it specifically talks about what can and cannot be done, and therefore shouldn't be infringed. I could go on, but I gave you the Constitution for you to read so that you can, on your own, okay, peruse this after this session tonight. You can go ahead and look at the other amendments and recognize, okay, where that comes from. Now, the second major principle is liberalism. Many of us, okay, would often look at that as natural rights. Well, where do we find natural rights best expressed if it isn't in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence? So we start off, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Why? Because everybody who was an American at that time was very familiar with what was happening and all of the things, okay, that they were dealing with, etc. That all men are created equal. So these words are not, I'm sure, new to any of you. But their words are very significant. All men are created equal. Certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, we hear about that a lot. To secure these rights, I missed the word, it should be governments are instituted among men. Where do they get their power? From the consent of the governed, from us. And it is the right of the people to abolish or alter this government if it doesn't follow the protections that were warranted. But the last part here that I have on the board is one that's sometimes overlooked. Institute new government. In other words, the founders were not in favor in any shape or form to create an anarchy. They wanted to make sure, okay, that a new government would be instituted. Within the Bill of Rights, well, we don't have too far to go there. That's pretty obvious, correct? Our natural rights are listed. 27 rights are found in the first 8 amendments. And by the way, the 9th and the 10th amendments are very interesting because the 9th Amendment took care of one of the objections that many people had, which is, gee, what happens if I don't list a right? Does that mean I'm protected if later on we identify a right? And the 9th Amendment essentially says, just because it wasn't listed doesn't mean you don't have it. Here's an interesting side note, however. The Supreme Court has never used the 9th Amendment to, okay, create a new right. What they have done is they have used other parts of other amendments, okay, to discuss it. For example, privacy could easily come under 9th Amendment. They don't need to. They went to the 4th Amendment. They went to several others, okay, to come up with the privacy issues. First Amendment, most of you are familiar with the fact that there were 5 initial rights: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. I added association because in the 1950s, that was an add-on. In other words, just because we assemble together, what does it mean if I associate and belong to organizations? That should be protected as well. 5th Amendment, just again, I'm just trying to give a sense of what is available here. The grand jury, double jeopardy, self-incrimination, and I did put in bold, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This will become important to us, okay, as the evening goes along. And of course, just compensation from eminent domain, and we'll discuss that a little bit as well. Third is republicanism. Representative government is an outburst of the Roman Republic that we borrowed when we created our new system of government. But it's the second part that we probably don't emphasize enough today. It's the second part that the framers were most concerned with. citizens need to reflect civic virtue. Civic virtue is essentially the following: giving up my own self-interest in order to promote the common good. Giving up my own self-interest in order to promote the common good. The framers of the Constitution, the founders of our government, were very concerned that if natural rights was the only thing that we operated under, there would be conflict all the time. There would be serious issues, because what I consider to be my natural right may not be, what another person may consider to be theirs. They may not, have the same understanding. And so therefore, how do I make it work? And the notion was, I'll make it work through the notion of civic virtue, where people need to have this. Now, this is an issue. James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. I don't think any of us in this room, will disagree with that. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Now, this would appear to say, how do I deal with this? Well, all of the framers were very, very concerned about human nature. They saw human nature in some of its most negative ways. They would make statements like, if a man has power, he's going to want more power. If a man has power and is going to want to make sure that he can lord it over others, that greed and avarice would be determinants in how one is going to do things. So why James Madison mentions this is not because he's trusting that civic virtue will always be there. What he's really saying is civic virtue may be very difficult to achieve. Therefore, he helped create a government where the institutions that were created would help to be able to stop this potential for abuse of power, for greater greed. Now, how does that translate? Well, the easiest examples I can give you are separation of powers and checks and balances. So if I have 3 separate branches of government, each having their own sphere of influence over governing, and then allow some of these to interact with each other, the understanding was this would allow for less abuse of power. Madison will even go further, and some of the other framers will as well. They'll say, even if we have instances in the history that are reflective of men who are leaders, I guess we'd have to say men and women, who are leaders, and they are essentially corrupt, then the issue becomes what? It becomes, how can we assure ourselves that that will not bear against us and bear against the government and the people? Not an easy thing. But I've always been fascinated by the fact that our framers understood human behavior and understood it in such a way that they essentially understood the need for people to develop civic virtue. Matter of fact, Thomas Jefferson, and if I can quote his words, he wrote in his notes on state of Virginia, he said, in educating the youths of genius from among the classes of the poor, he remarks that the people are the ultimate guardians of their own liberty. In every human on earth is some trace of human weakness, some germ of corruption and degeneracy, which cunning will discover and wickedness insensibly open, cultivate, and improve. Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people above, or alone, sorry. The people themselves, therefore, are the only safe depositories. And to render even them safe, their minds must be improved to a certain degree. And this is where he then espouses public education. That's where this will be achieved. If civic learning is not done in the schools, then what is the hope of being able to allow for this government to develop the virtues necessary to be able to maintain this government? So Republicanism and the Bill of Rights. Well, it's very easy to see that the Bill of Rights, okay, identifies individual rights. However, the Supreme Court has come in many cases, to assist in the common good. Let's take one clear example. 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. If you had left it to the majority, okay, of the people of the southern states, there would have been no, okay, equality for the Negroes, African Americans. That goes completely against, okay, the notion that some of the Southerners, okay, were espousing. And by the way, I'm not trying to leave the North off the hook, okay? We had our own discriminatory practices as well, but we seem to, okay, look at the Southern, okay, difficulties, because we look at the Jim Crow laws and we look at all the activities that were essentially making sure that the Negro stayed in place. Well, if it hadn't been for the Supreme Court, okay, the common good means everybody's interest is taken care of, not just a majority's interest. And that's crucial. So when we hear someone say the common good, it doesn't translate easily to simply majority will. Common good, majority will are not necessarily, okay, going to go hand in hand. They understood, our framers did, that there would always be tensions between liberalism, natural rights, and with republicanism. And they expected it. So let me give us some examples of what I'm talking about. Our natural right says that we should have the free exercise of our religion. However, there are certain religions that do not like any kind of medical procedures to be done. The Supreme Court now had to make a decision based upon, okay, we have a certain entities that say no vaccinations because their religion does not believe in that. And then we have the health of the country. And the court, okay, determined that the religion free exercise would be trumped in this particular way. So therefore, they would not be able to practice their religion for the greater health of the nation. Same thing with hate speech. People say, hey, I have the right to speak the way I want to speak. No. Certain speech, okay, determined as hate speech, implies that it may cause, okay, a lot of problems with other people, and so therefore it could get and create violence and do other things that would not be correct. So the court has ruled hate speech. Printing of the Pentagon Papers. again, a limitation. Government, okay, did not want this to occur. Okay, the Pentagon Papers, which identified, okay, some of the governmental issues that were done during the Vietnam War. And once that was exposed, it certainly, okay, painted the government in a negative way. Stop and frisk observations. You just read the Fourth Amendment, right? And I just told you that the Fourth Amendment says that you shouldn't be restricted, okay, in your homes, etc., correct? Well, we have so many instances and so many things that go on. If you're driving your car and you're pulled over because you were speeding or because you went through a red light, and in the back seat, okay, there's a gun, do they have to go get a warrant? See, the Supreme Court said no, because that was there, it was in the open. If the police officer had suspected that there might have been a gun or that there could have been drugs or there could have been something else and says to the individual in the car, open your trunk, that would have been a violation. So the Supreme Court is always weighing, okay, what is important for the common good, not trying to take away each person's natural rights. Another example is legislature. Smoking. I grew up in an age, and it's many of you, where, you know what? People smoked in everybody else's homes, smoke was everywhere, and it wasn't until the 1990s where all of a sudden, okay, we looked at the health risks that included those, okay, who did not smoke. And what did we do? We created laws, okay, that basically said, you know what? You can smoke if you want to. That right will not be taken away, but it will be taken away in public areas. So these are the kinds of things that I mean when I say, where is republicanism in the Bill of Rights? So today we'll take a look at the Bill of Rights and how did it come to pass? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the Renaissance. Now you can see from these pictures, probably some of them are very familiar to you, but the bottom line is we have the rise of individuals and the rise, I guess the best way to frame it is prior to the Renaissance, people's rights were often identified through the group they belonged to. Or I can frame it a different way. Because if you were a serf, one probably wouldn't identify with a great deal of rights, would we? But the fact of the matter is, in the medieval times, okay, few people had individual rights. They were identified through the groups that they were in. The Renaissance begins to change that, the 15th to 16th centuries. So that you have technological changes with the printing press, okay, with Gutenberg. You have changes on science. You have the philosopher, scientist Francis Bacon. You have, okay, the Galileo, Copernicus, all, okay, that are studying things. And, you know, in Copernicus's situation, as well as Galileo, the Catholic Church was dominant at that time. And of course, they did not understand or believe that anything that contradicted their view of the world was correct. So when Copernicus and Galileo, okay, are making their presentations nearly a century apart, okay, those claims were, okay, not, okay, approved. And in many cases, there was a great deal of persecution. You had religious change, Martin Luther, okay, the 95 Theses in Wittenberg. You had literature, Shakespeare. You had art, Da Vinci, Michelangelo. All of the accomplishments, if you recall, it wasn't just going back to the Greek and Roman times that they were trying to see resurge, which thus gave the name Renaissance. But they were also looking and seeing how the individual was growing. The English Bill of Rights is the second that I'm identifying. I could have gone to the Magna Carta, except that the Magna Carta was in 1215, so it doesn't really help us a great deal. But the English Bill of Rights occurred after they kicked out the King of England. James II was kicked out, and they went to the Netherlands, and they got William and Mary and brought them over and allowed them to be monarchs. They had to sign an agreement, the Revolution Settlement, that allowed for them, okay, to rule in England. And then they had to agree to the English Bill of Rights, which now said that Parliament had the right to renege on the king's notion of taxation, that they could rule against excessive fines and things of that nature. So that was where that came from. And the reason I put it there is because Americans looked at this and said, wait a minute, if Parliament has these rights, over the next century, they're going to look at them and say, we should have, okay, these as individual rights. State Declarations of Rights, Virginia. Virginia wrote its Declaration of Rights in 1776. Please note, we have liberalism and republicanism. I'm not going to read the entire thing. If you can read it, fine. What I'm looking for is the following. The Virginia Declaration of Rights is talking about similar things that you saw in the Declaration of Independence, correct? Here's what's interesting. This was signed June 12th, 1776. Do you think Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, okay, knew about this document? Just 3 weeks later, okay, they wrote their document. Notice the language. Some of it is very interesting, very similar. The second, of course, power is vested in the people. Government is influenced, notice, for the common benefit. I just put there that because I want you to understand the notion of republicanism was very strong. Then they talk about the separation of powers, and I thought some of you would be interested in finding out, okay, that yes, some people did think about term limits. And then the elections for representatives ought to be free. Now the next two slides talk specifically about things that we will see eventually found in the Bill of Rights. So in 1776, we have in Article 8, we have parts of the 6th and the 5th Amendments that will be part of the British Bill of Rights. The second area is if excessive bail, excessive fines, cruel and unusual punishment, those are terms that you probably recall. Those are all found in the 8th Amendment. General warrants, again, we just talked about that. Those are going to be in the 4th Amendment. And then we have the importance of the trial by jury. And the trial by jury, for everyone's understanding, is not in, there's reference to it, by the way, but there's the initial reference is right here in the 3rd article of the Constitution. So Section 2, Clause 3, the United States Constitution. And then the next slide, okay, continues to talk about the freedom of the press, First Amendment. Second Amendment, notice, it is a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. The next part, standing armies in time of peace, we didn't follow with that. And the third part I thought was interesting, and that is that the military should be under the control of a civilian government. And of course, we did do that in Article 2 of the Constitution. That no free government can be preserved but by the firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue. Notice, they're fully aware, as I mentioned earlier, about what? The importance of civic virtue. Those are the kinds of virtues that would be exemplified by people. And then finally, religion. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion. So my point is important because what we want to be able to do here is reference the fact that when we study the Bill of Rights, we are truly studying something that was going on in other states. Now, what I've given to you is the Bill of Rights. No, I have one. Thank you. So I'm going to leave that slide there, and I want to take a quick look at what you have in your hands. And perhaps we can put the lights on so that people can see it more clearly. Once again, I'm not going to go through every single one of these pages. What I've done is I've picked and chosen different aspects that relate to the talk that we're having today. So, in the Massachusetts Constitution, which, by the way, is the oldest still used constitution in the world. It was approved, ratified in 1780. There is no constitution that is in practice that is older. Now, I see Senator Moore is here, so I'm going to say, okay, there might be some movement around, okay, to have another ratification of a new constitution, but I have a feeling that's not going to happen. So notice Article 1. What are we dealing with? Something that we just saw in the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This was passed in 1780, so it is after the Declaration of Independence. Still important. Then we have religion. Again, Article 4, we have referring to the importance of consent of governed. We have Article 5. Then Article 6, dealing with no titles of nobility. That's in the Constitution itself. Notice, we don't want any vestiges from the British government. Article 12 deals with Amendments 6 and 5, as well as the United States Constitution. I'm sorry, I didn't go to the back page. My apologies. Article 7 goes with the preamble of the Constitution. Article 8, the term limits. Article 10 deals with the second paragraph of the Declaration, but it also deals with our obligation to taxation. Amendment 5, the takings clause, that's eminent domain. We'll be looking at that in a few moments. Article 11, again, Amendments 6 and 7. Please take a look at this, and that's the reason why I've given it to you in this format as opposed to here. Take a look at that and note, okay, the importance of what was done in 1780 and what eventually occurred in 1787, 88 with the Constitution, and with the 1791 ratification of the Bill of Rights. That, okay, is, okay, what these papers will indicate. Okay, next. Then we get into the Federalist and Anti-Federalist views on the Federal Bill of Rights. At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they decide not to add a Bill of Rights. Now, part of that is practical. They've been sweltering in the heat for 4 months. They've been told they can't tell anybody what's going on. I would say that there were some strong tempers that have been exhibited, that there was a lot of difficulty going on. And here they were in the last week, and George Mason, by the way, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, who turns around and says, wait a minute, we can't have a constitution without a Bill of Rights. And partly the exhaustion, as well as Some people simply saying we don't really need one because the states have their own. However, when the anti-federalists get their engines going in opposition to this Constitution, the number one thing that they are most concerned about is the lack of a Bill of Rights. So that's where they're going to be coming out. So the ratification process, okay, needed to have 9 of 13 states to ratify the Constitution. Within the process, several states will use the lack of a Bill of Rights as a major force against the Constitution. Now, the first 5 states that ratified the Constitution did so pretty much without too much difficulty. Number one, okay, the Federalists were in charge, so they were able to get everybody going and getting the ratification conventions going so that they could go ahead and vote on the Constitution. And then there was Massachusetts. All of a sudden, Massachusetts is reviewing the Constitution. And you had a very significant difficulty because you had the Federalists who were in support of the Constitution and wanted it done, and you had the anti-Federalists who were not just angry with the Bill of Rights, by the way, just because that's what our talk is about. They were upset with a lot of other things, that they felt that this national government was going to have too much power, was not going to be limited enough. So getting back to constitutionalism, all of these ideas were strongly held by the anti-federalists. But the one thing that seemed to resonate the most was not having a Bill of Rights. That was the one thing that resonated the most. Massachusetts passed and ratified the Constitution February 6th, 1788. Very close vote. Very close vote. And for those of you who may remember when about 1.5 years ago when I was portraying Amos Singletary here at the mansion, okay, Amos Singletary was a member of the ratifying convention. And he was a strong anti-federalist. I mean, he went bonkers as he discussed the fact that how could we possibly have a constitution, okay, that had this much power and would not be as limited as it needed to be. Finally, the anti-federalists are going to use, okay, their arguments, and they're going to simply say, listen, when you have a national government that's got broad powers, then how can they be sure that the rights of the people will be protected? They're going to argue that even though there are some rights protected in the Constitution, those that aren't mentioned, what does that mean? Will they be protected? And then, of course, they were mostly concerned because we just fought a war over the fact that our rights had been denied us. So why wouldn't we want a constitution that had a Bill of Rights that would support, okay, their liberties, etc.? Well, the Federalists, they had to counter the argument. So their view is, we already have some of these rights that are listed in the Constitution already. Ex post facto laws, habeas corpus, all of these are within the Constitution. So these are there. No titles of nobility, as I referenced earlier. Most bills of rights, they said, existed between a king and the people, or the king and parliament. So in other words, why do you need that when the people are the sovereign ones? They are the ones that are in charge. And then the states would also argue, or they would argue rather, that the states were the first line of government for the people. Federal government's not going to have a lot to do with us. The states are going to control us. And by the way, even though our media and our political system seems to funnel most of its attention nationally, where do we have most of our interactions? Our local and states. So even though we seem to have a really tilted version, the fact of the matter is, even today, most of our interactions in government are at the local and state levels, not the national government. That doesn't mean that there isn't any. It just means that that's not the largest area. And finally, listing rights would be the possibility that what would happen if there were other rights to be identified, which is an argument I made a few moments ago. So what happens? Well, in the process that I mentioned, okay, they gave those reservations. James Madison is going to run for office. Now, if you recall correctly, in the Constitution, the senators were to be appointed by the governor or by the state legislatures. Okay? Now, that was true up until 1913, when the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was written. Well, the governor of Virginia was Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry did not believe in this constitutional convention, therefore did not believe in the outcome, which was the Constitution. As a matter of fact, it is recorded historically that when he was asked about this constitutional convention, his reply was very succinct. I smell a rat. The result of which is that James Madison, even though he was the architect of the Constitution, was not going to get selected as a senator in the state of Virginia. So he ran for Congress instead. Guess who he ran against? Another future president, James Monroe. Same district, and he eventually, okay, does win the seat, and James Madison will become the first. Now, he promised that he would, okay, work on a Bill of Rights, because he saw the writing on the wall. The Anti-Federalists were looking for any excuse to not have this Constitution go into effect. Over 200 suggestions are going to be made. They weren't all rights. Many of them were structural changes that they wanted to have. He whittled it down to 12. What's very interesting is James Madison was a very astute politician. He knew that the Anti-Federalists, okay, had a very strong case. So what he ended up doing was he ended up making sure that the Anti-Federalists didn't make their propositions first. He made his propositions first. He was therefore able to carve out those aspects within the Bill of Rights that were the most suitable to him. So he was able to whittle it down to 12 amendments, included a preamble, included, okay, some others, that finally got agreed upon by the House of Representatives, 12 of them. However, when it went to the states, only 10 of them were ratified. So there should have been, the first 10 amendments should have been, first 12 amendments, I guess you could say, should have been the Bill of Rights. And the first two are very interesting. The first one is now in the Constitution. It was added in 1992. It is the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. And all that it said was, Congress cannot vote itself a salary while they are in session, meaning within that term that they are in session. So as a result, if they vote for a salary, it will be for the next session. And that was the First Amendment that was proposed in 1789. The Second Amendment is going to be a huge surprise, and it was to make sure that we had one representative for every 40,000 people instead of 30,000 people. Now, I'm no mathematician, as many of you know. We have 320 million people in the United States. So if we had gone by that guideline of 1 per 40,000, what do you think? You think that we'd have some civic centers instead of a Capitol building as our, seat of government? Obviously. Okay. They were thinking in those terms at that particular time, and needless to say, that amendment never did change. However, in 1907, Congress did finalize, and it hasn't moved since then, that the House would have 435 members. And of course, the Constitution had already agreed upon the fact that every state would have 2 senators, and so therefore, that has remained the case till today. So how effective is this Bill of Rights? You would think that James Madison, who devoted so much attention to doing his due diligence, would have thought that what he had accomplished, was a great thing. Well, he wasn't convinced. He just called it a parchment barrier. As far as he was concerned, this was not going to really do a great deal. And interestingly enough, he was right. Because in 1833, the first case brought to the Supreme Court that is going to be dealing with the Bill of Rights is going to be denied to a person who tried to use the federal Bill of Rights in order to get a remedy for injuries. Here was his injuries. Barron owned a wharf, a docking area for boats. Baltimore is trying to improve its city. And it got permits, and what it did is it started to make better streets, bigger streets. And what do you think happened to Barron's Wharf? All of a sudden, the water wasn't reaching it. So he sues under the 5th Amendment of the Federal Constitution that says that if you are impacted by anything that is being done by government negatively, you have the right to just compensation. He argued that he should be given some compensation. Well, guess what? They didn't give it to him. John Marshall, is the Supreme Court Justice. He's listening to this case, and he agrees with Baltimore. And he agrees not because of the merits of the case. He agrees with Baltimore because the Federal Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. Which, by the way, most of the people who would have been in the 1780s and early 90s would have agreed that it shouldn't apply to the states. So he was merely, expressing a position that the framers had already articulated. So, Amendment 14 comes along, one of the Civil War amendments, one of the most important amendments in our Constitution. We could do that on another discussion, but the bottom line is this. Changes regarding the Bill of Rights are going to begin as a result of the 14th Amendment. Slowly, not quickly. And here's our 14th Amendment. The first part has been in discussion in this campaign, so you should be aware of the fact that that 14th Amendment has a great deal to do, with the definition of citizenship. But the second part says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This is a substantial case, or amendment rather, that has changed pretty much the lives of the United States and the lives of Americans in this time frame. Had the slaughterhouse cases of the early 1870s been accepted by the Supreme Court, we probably wouldn't be talking today about the issue, that's going to come forward. See, the notion of privileges and immunities implies that everybody has the rights to be able to be protected under what would be considered the Bill of Rights or any other rights, your property rights, your liberty rights. In other words, all of these things, okay, would fall under that characterization. So, as a result of the slaughterhouse cases not being accepted, and thus the Privileges and Immunities Clause not being looked upon from the perspective of everyone's rights need to be addressed through due process of law or through the privileges and immunities, we had to then go through a slower process of incorporating our rights. So here's the definition for incorporation. It's the process through which the United States Supreme Court applies the due process of clause of the 14th Amendment to extend the reach of the Bill of Rights to include protection from interference by states. So, we get to individual cases relating to the Bill of Rights that are now going to be before the Supreme Court, and the court is going to look at each of these different cases and it's going to make a determination as to whether or not this right in the Bill of Rights should apply to the states in doing what the Bill of Rights guarantees. So, Gitlow versus New York. This is going to relate to freedom of speech. It's the first part of freedom of speech that gets incorporated. Now, Gitlow belonged to the Communist Party. And he was making pamphlets, he was making speeches, okay, supportive of the Communist Party. And so therefore, he was, okay, basically promoting through speech, and he got arrested, put in jail by the state of New York. So he sues, saying that he has the right to free speech guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution. He loses the Supreme Court case. And he does not win the case. But the significance of the case is, A, freedom of speech is a guarantee that the states must accept. Where was the reasoning why he lost? Because most of the justices basically had the argument that, or bought the argument, that when somebody professes a particular belief, violence could ensue. And if violence were to ensue, this is inciting, okay, violence. And so they bought the argument that Gitlow was not, okay, under this, would not be protected, but this is the first incorporated case that is going to start the process throughout the 1920s that are going to bring us to this point. Freedom of religion, Everson versus the Board of Education at Ewing Township. This had everything to do with the Establishment Clause. What does it mean, the Establishment Clause? It means that anything in which public monies would be expended in order to promote a religion would be considered unconstitutional. He argued, Everson was arguing, okay, that the school children from a Catholic school should not be given public transportation provided by the city of the, or in this case, the township of Ewing. And he argued, okay, that that was in conflict with the First Amendments, okay, where they do not want government to have interference or promotion of the establishment of religion. That case was won by the Board of Ed, Ewing Township, primarily on the basis that there really is no government involvement in simply providing transportation. So that was the way in which they argued that case. From that case, other cases came that references, okay, the notion of Establishment Clause, and then other cases on the free exercise. DeYoung versus Oregon, the freedom of assembly issue. This is, again, another Communist Party issue. People coming together. The court, okay, once again, ruled and said, guess what? You're allowed to assemble. You've just got to make sure that it does not, okay, promote anarchy, does not promote anything of that nature. Search and seizure. Wolf versus Colorado. This was a doctor who was performing abortions. They needed to find out whether or not he was. No one was coming forward. Government went into his office, stole his records, and in looking at his records, they saw that, yes, indeed, he was, okay, performing abortions. Therefore, they arrested him, and he sued on the fact that the Fourth Amendment says that your right to your papers, your home, from unreasonable searches, okay, should have been guaranteed to him. The Fourth Amendment assured him of that. There was no general search warrant. They just went in. From that case, we go on to other cases where incorporation is going to allow for the Fourth Amendment to be used in search and seizure issues. Finally, the right to counsel. We have the Gideon versus Wainwright case. Up until that time, there was no guarantee that a person who was indigent or poor could possibly have representation. Okay, let's go to Gideon, okay, was a drifter. He had no money. He would be considered homeless today. He was arrested. And he asked to have court representation. Florida said no, they put him in jail. He writes a handwritten plea to the Supreme Court on prison stationery. Okay? And he simply says, I believe that I should have the right to be represented. I don't have any money. I don't have anything. But I should be represented. And he says that the Sixth Amendment guarantees, and the 14th Amendment says that states should be beholden, okay, to the First Amendment, first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Abe Fortas, who later became a justice of the Supreme Court, took the case, and they ended up overturning the case called Betts versus Brady. And I don't want you thinking it's Mookie versus Tom. It simply was a case in which the only way in which you could get some kind of counsel or attorney would have been simply and only if you had the right to, if you were young, if you were mentally, if you had mental issues. Those were the only types of cases. So it didn't have anything to do with poverty. Unanimous decision, 9-0, was in favor of Gideon. They said he should get a new trial and he should have, okay, the right to counsel. And then he was retried in Florida, and Gideon was found not guilty. From that moment, we have had all capital cases, criminal cases, are now provide counsel to anyone who can afford one. So, how do I want you to take a look at what we've been discussing? Just a little over an hour from where we started. I want you to take a look at it through the lens of constitutionalism, liberalism, republicanism. I think if we do that, I think we understand a little bit better what it is that our founders were putting together when they were, in this case, doing the Bill of Rights, or whatever other cases that they were involved with. So we get to this point. Are my rights your rights? An interesting question. If we look at contemporary issues that we have today, look at freedom of religion. Freedom of speech. Freedom of assembly. Privacy. Accused rights. I could go on, obviously, with different ones, but I just wanted to just tease you, if I could, to thinking about some of the current issues that confront us as a nation. And looking at, okay, what we've been discussing, and looking at it from the perspective of, okay, you know, you and I can all have conversations, and we can have conversations with our neighbors, we can have conversations, okay, with people across the country, and people are going to hold totally different positions and viewpoints. I would ask the question, are the rights that I believe are extremely important to me your rights? And I can rephrase that. Are your rights my rights? I think if we look at, okay, things in that kind of a juxtaposition, my sense is that perhaps we can come up with a more moderate view rather than the polarizing views that we seem to have generating in our election cycle and pretty much throughout the nation, correct? I don't think I'm saying anything that nobody would disagree with. So, these come with the prepared, okay, remarks, and hopefully this has given some kind of glue for your ideas and beliefs and where we're going. I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. I'm going to ask a couple of things if I could. And please feel free to be frank. The bottom line is we're going to distribute a survey. If you could answer some of the questions and just discussing what we're doing, because as I said at the beginning of the evening, we're trying to find a way to discuss relevant areas of about government in a way that would allow for people to have a better understanding of how our government started and where we are today. So while you may be asking me some questions, we'll pass along these papers. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, David?
I'm interested to know if incorporation of rights requires or depends upon judicial action.
No, it can be legislated, but mostly it's been done through the courts, because it has much more, okay, gravitas. In other words, let me rephrase that. The legislature, federal legislature, would have no jurisdiction of being able to do that to the states. So it would have to come through the courts. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Jim.
Why do you think they have not used the Ninth Amendment, ever?
I think it's because, and this is what I've learned, okay, from others, they're afraid that because the Ninth Amendment is so broad, that it could be a dangerous precedent. That what would happen is then you would open up a lot more use of the Ninth Amendment. And they would prefer to use other amendments to be able to discuss any kinds of additional things. That's my understanding. It's more to avoid what might be considered an avalanche of other cases under the premise that, hey, I consider this a right, I should be able to do this, and let's use the Ninth Amendment because none of the others directly involve it. Privacy is the biggest example, because privacy, some people would argue, does not really have any kind of a strict measurement. But I look at Amendment 3, for example, quartering of soldiers. Okay, that's privacy. I'm not going to allow somebody to come into my house if the government wants to house soldiers. Fourth Amendment, the issue of, I should be safe in my house from people just coming into it. So privacy has been able to be used through other amendments. But the Ninth Amendment, I think they were more reluctant to using it because they're afraid it would open the floodgates to other types of things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to thank both Roger and Claudette for all their work on behalf of civic education in the state and elsewhere.
Thanks, Jamie.
Question, so the founders were a very extraordinary group of guys, and they create a timeless document. Talk a little bit about the kinds of educations that they had. What were the kind of books that they read? What were the things that mattered to them? What shaped them and helped shape these ideas?
Well, that's one of the fascinations, okay, with most of our founders, and that is that they were incredibly brilliant and intelligent and read everything. Just to give you one example about James Madison, Little Jemmy, as he was called. He's our shortest president, by the way. He was 5'4". But James Madison, essentially, when he was preparing for the Constitutional Convention, he read everything that he could about philosophy, about government, from the Greeks, from the Romans, from everything that he could get his hands on. He came to the convention so well prepared that he was able to almost dictate the conversation. And of course, had he been able to, we probably would have had a different constitution, because he had other like-minded individuals, perhaps not as astute and understanding and learned as he was, but they knew about government, and they researched and they studied it. One of the fascinations about our government, and I say this often about John Adams, John Adams, the only word I can give you that fits his notion of what he was able to accomplish was he was giddy about the opportunity to create a government. Think about it. Think about it. He was living at a time in which the revolution occurred, and he was also one of the leaders that could actually put into practice those ideas that he had been studying and learning all along. So all of the people that you're talking about, they read all of that was available to them. Thomas Jefferson, as many of you know, okay, had some, was such a learned person, but his interests were beyond just government. He studied science, he studied astronomy, he studied everything. The man, okay, was just simply brilliant. He was an inventor of so many different things. So these were all men that I would say were the Renaissance men of their time, because they really learned a great deal about what was going on. I don't know if that answers your question, but I look at that period of time, and maybe it's because I'm a history teacher and a government teacher, and I simply, okay, have had the luxury of being able to study this period. But I too get very excited over the fact that these men created a government that was not a government to pad their pocketbooks and wallets. These people, okay, were really interested in doing something positive. Now, I look at the French Revolution, for example, that started while they were discussing the Bill of Rights in that first Congress, July 14, 1789. the French Revolution, okay, may have started off with very high principles, but they didn't have the leaders that we had to create a system in France that was going to not be serving their individual needs, whether that be grabbing power or influence or getting and making money. So that, to me, is one of the major distinctions that we have had. Another thing that I think is fascinating is in 1915, there were 15 democracies in the world. There are over 120 democracies today. These democracies, okay, are based in large part on our experiment. Now, I'm not going to tell any of you in this room, okay, that these democracies are working beautifully. Neither is ours. Part of the reason why we think that this kind of discussion that we're having tonight is important is because without monitoring the government that we have, we are in jeopardy. In other words, we can't take it for granted. I can tell you what I believe was well done in the 1780s and the 1790s, but I can also tell you there were some things that weren't so well done. I'm just emphasizing those things that I think were really, okay, positive. I mean, if you listen to some of their debates, there were people that were greedy at that time. There were people who were looking for power at that time. They wouldn't have been able to say that human nature was a problem if they didn't see it around them. They knew it, but they were trying to find ways to overcome it. And we have to do the same. And we can't do it unless we know what it is that our government stands for. Not just the platitudes, okay, that get strung out and spoken daily, that in many cases I don't believe have a lot of merit. I think we need to be looking at a greater depth. And that doesn't mean that we're all going to agree. But guess what? We should have a discussion about it, not a yelling match, not a way of trying to manipulate, okay, for electioneering purposes. I mean, all of us, in observing what's going on, we are, I won't say disgusted, but that may very well be the term, but we're definitely frustrated by the fact, okay, that we don't believe that the government that we have currently is the government that was provided to us, or stated a different way. We don't believe that all the information is there for us to know whether or not this government is operating as it should be. I thank you very much, okay, for your attendance tonight. Glad to see that some of you were not afraid of the elements. Then there are those of you who were probably saying, gee, I might get, I was going to go out, but then I didn't want to go on the Mass Turnpike because then I would have to experience, okay, the new toll system. Bottom line is, thank you so much for your presence, and we can continue our dialogue in the other room over some apple cider and other things. Thank you.